When the ballroom lights hit the chandelier, they made the whole room look as if it had been lacquered in honey. Glass and silk, and somebody's idea of mercy for the bored rich glittered under the ceiling. I had a tray in each hand and a name tag stuck too low on the polyester of my server dress, the blue of it sagging with sweat against my back. The charity printed the schedules in gold. The guests printed their alibis in better fonts. I printed mine in overtime and late fees. 3 hours before, at Denny's, Marcos had squinted at the copy of the lease on my table and done that arithmetic with his mouth that men do when they think counting up someone else's money will make it theirs for a minute. 2 months, he said. That table by the window, keep that table moving. Tonight's heavy on tips if you hustle. Carmen winked at him, slid a coffee, and went back to arranging the piles of silverware like talismans. She always set the forks to the left and the knives to the right, and said it calmed the kitchen spirits. She'd learned her rituals in a restaurant where every odd rule had once saved someone a shift. At the gala, the air smelled of perfume and old money and the kind of cologne that was made to trace the coastlines of people who never paid for parking. The music was slow and perfectly polite. A dozen servers spiraled through the crowd, speaking the language of polite apologies and shorter rehearsed phrases. I moved like somebody who had memorized a map of exhaustion. I saw him before I saw his father. The small, deliberate person off by the draped windows, a child with a constellation of noises behind his name. He was not dressed like a guest, not in tux nor satin. Someone had given him a jacket that looked like it belonged to a boutique that made small adjustments for small bodies. He held a star-shaped stress ball in one hand, fingers pressed to the seams, not squeezing, but reverent with it. He had a line where his brow met his nose that suggested he kept counting things inside his head. Steps, breaths, seconds. Lily was on my hip, the purple hippo tucked into her armpit like a secret, and I moved with the practiced care of someone who'd learned to be small when necessary and fierce when it mattered. She had insisted on coming. "There'll be cake," she had said solemnly before we left, as if cake were an argument the world could never refuse. She carried a paper crown and a crayon in her pocket and wore a dress I'd washed 3 times to get the old marker out of the hem. He watched the room the way some people watch a weather pattern, waiting for a shift he could count on. When he followed my eyes, there was a loneliness in him that wasn't the sort that begged. It was the kind that arranged the chairs in the air in perfect rows and then wondered why no one sat down. Mikhail. I learned the name when a woman in a gown the color of pond water, she looked like money, but she smelled like resentment, murmured it as she passed. "Poor thing," she said, and her pity was the sort you hand out to feel yourself generous. I tried to make myself invisible. Invisibility had been a practical skill. In high school, it kept you from the worst of the gossip. In the years with Lily, it stretched to protect us from landlords and from acquaintances with the habit of pressing questions into mouths. But you can't stay invisible around small things that need you. Lily tugged at my sleeve and pointed to the music box on a table near the edge of the dance floor, the one that played a thin loop of Swan Lake for people who consider nostalgia a charity in itself. Mikhail's hands were precise when they touched the star. He aligned the star with the seam of the curtain. He set his feet in a pattern I could almost copy. Lily toddled closer, offered him her purple hippo without fanfare. He accepted as if it were a piece of correspondence. She talked to him like he was the only person in the room whose vocabulary included dragons and trains. In that moment, he toppled the borders of his careful map and let a faint smile pull at one side of his mouth. I adjusted a plate on a guest's lap and found the tray awkward under my arm. The music swelled, and a couple rose to dance, their faces lit in the way people reserve for glass. An elderly woman at the next table coughed into a napkin and announced to no one that charity is both a virtue and a social lubricant. The crowd loosened and tightened like the sea. Mikhail had always been good at noticing small swings of the world. He noticed how the light hit the star and how the shadow made a second star on the table. He noticed how a row of knives had been set unevenly near the buffet and removed them with a precision that made the hostess glance up as if the child had performed a domestic miracle. I was close enough to see his nails were short, like someone who liked the feel of a pencil against a page. He moved to the fringe of the dance floor and looked like a compass that had decided to point inward. Lily, patient and insistent, grabbed both of his hands and began to hop. She was small and serious, the sort of child who negotiates the rules for a game and then imposes them with the gravity of a treaty. I remember the way people's eyes slid across us, an unpaid scene. To some of them, we were an interruption to the polished flow. To others, we were entertainment. Two kids inventing a choreography to a song someone had written for glassware and old men. I sat one plate down and watched Mikhail and Lily. He watched the music the way he watched the star, trying to find the pattern. Lily set her feet, counted under her breath, a roundhouse of numbers that she'd learned at the daycare, and she pulled him into a small, simple dance. They were clumsy and perfect, like two objects finding alignment. For a moment, the crowd contracted to the size of breath. Alexander Vulov appeared as if he'd been waiting in a dark at the edge of the light and decided the light was where the lesser prey gathered. He did not enter with a swagger or a loud introduction. He moved like a hand that had been doing this work for a long time, surgical, certain. He was taller than most of the men in the room and wore a suit that read like a promise. Tailored, midnight, expensive enough to hush a table full of complaints. He scented the air with tobacco and something else, maybe cedar, maybe winter, that drew attention in a room already full of important smells. He watched by the window, and the security around him, Anton and two others, tightened like an invisible rope. Anton's face was efficient, a man who knew what loyalty bought. He nodded to his lieutenants in that short language men use when they do not want to say anything that would make the chandelier wobble. Vulov's eyes rested on his son, and in that look, the room changed. Space opened. It wasn't the look of a man used to getting whatever he wanted without thought. It was the look of someone who had learned the value of small mercies. You could see, in that hold of his gaze, a father who had tried to buy stability and had found it complicated and exasperating and worth everything. He moved toward us, polite in the way that suggested he recorded every movement like a ledger. He said my name as if he had a ledger for names, and mine had a small, neat entry. Sophie Williams, he said, and the syllables landed warm and precise. He did not ask permission to cross the room. Anton's hand never left the back of a chair. I kept my hands on the tray because hands that are supposed to be busy are less likely to tremble. Lily tucked closer to me. Vulov's jaw softened as he watched the two children. He turned to his security, one word, a tight command, and then back to me. "You dance with him," he said of Mikhail, but the sentence folded around other possibilities. His voice was quiet and very close to being dangerous in the way a cliff is dangerous, obvious and silent. I started. I had 1,000 words in my mouth, all measured out. I'm a waitress. I don't work with children. I have a daughter. We don't belong here. Instead, I said, Lily likes to dance. The truth had a different melody when the rich listened. He smiled then, the smallest movement, and reached into an inner pocket for a small leather case. For him, he said, and produced a music box no larger than my palm. It was lacquered dark, the kind of object you never see unless you exist in rooms where money breathes. He opened it, and the thin thread of Swan Lake slid out like a memory on a drawer. For his room, he added. Mikhail took the music box like it was an object that finally understood him. He nestled it in his hands like a bird. The stress ball went into his pocket with the steady precision of someone putting the world back into an order that made sense. Before he left, Vulov turned back to me, and the gesture was not a demand and not an entreaty. It was a proposition wearing the face of a question. "We should speak," he said, "after the event. My driver will take you back." I laughed once, a sound that was both sincere and used to being what it was. "I have a shift at 3, I said. "You have a daughter's bedtime," he said, and the mode of his speech made it an observation rather than a plan. "Take a minute after." He handed me a card. On the back was a name and a number and the exact times they expected someone if they needed someone who could be trusted not to make trouble. I've been paid for my hands and my silence before. I know how money can look like forgiveness, and how it can be the exact same thing as a leash. I tucked the card into my apron and moved on. The night blurred into trays and small apologies. The hostess bowed to the wealthy. The woman in pond green murmured something about temperament and motherhood, and how children are colored by the company they keep. After the gala, when the ballroom emptied and the guests left with pockets of leftover wine and discretionary mercy, Anton found me near the stage, wiping a glass with a napkin. He did not touch me. He didn't need to. He merely said, "Mr. Vulov asked you to come by tomorrow. We'll have a car." His voice was a list. I told Lily we'd been at a big party. She ate jam on toast and held her purple hippo like proof that she had survived glitter and strangers. I let her watch the music box's lullaby on my phone for a minute. The recording was thin, like warmth through a pane of glass. The next day, Marcos checked my schedule and didn't look surprised. He had the economy's smell about him, the same as the landlords and the banks. "Do it," he said when I told him Vulov wanted to see me. "You get $5,000 for a night and you're—"
"Kidding me? You're not taking it?" He had a habit of saying every sentence like an unpaid bill. Carmen chewed her lower lip and said, "Just watch the edges." She had arrangements to make at the restaurant. She'd been doing favors for me for as long as I'd been there. She tied her hair up and pressed 2 extra rolls into my hands. "For Lily," she said. "Don't speak unless spoken to." The check came in an envelope so heavy with paper value, I had to fold my hand around it to make it smaller. I opened it in the vestibule of my apartment because I was like that, practical and slow to celebrate. The number was real. It was a figure that rebuilt a month of rent in a breath. It made all the small arithmetic in my head rearrange themselves into something that could be called breathing room. The offer that followed was simpler than any of the novels I'd read as a teenager, and scarier in the ways real life can be. The terms were on my mother's dining table 2 days later. Paid companionship for Mikhail. 3 days a week from 4 to 8 in the evening. $5,000 a week, or $20,000 a month if I preferred weekly certainty to monthly ease. Anton explained the schedule in his clipped way and handed me a small card that had the number of someone I could call if I needed immediate assistance. Not for me, but for logistics. There were cameras in the entrance and always a man or two in the garden, and if I ever felt unsafe, I should use the house phone and ask for Anton. It was not a job description like any I'd filled before. It was precise, like the silverware the hostess insisted we line up before a dinner. I would be part of his son's evenings. I would read, lead simple games, help with a routine that seemed to make the child's world less jagged. I would not be an employee in the usual sense. I would be, Anton had said the word with the disinterested air security men use, companion. I thought of Lily as if she were a small currency whose value I had been trying to maximize in a market that favored people with better names. Lily with the hair that tangled every morning like someone who's been in a permanent chase with imagination. Lily who had learned to say mama like an emergency drill and make it feel like a promise. I thought of the rent envelope and the stack of bills and the silence of the landlord's answering machine. I thought about the way the music box had slid into Mikhail's fingers like a small island of grace, and realized how thin the line was between grace and commerce. That night, I lay on the couch and watched Lily sleep with the purple hippo draped over her hand. I thought of the silverware here at home, cheap forks dinged on the uneven edges, spoons that had lost their polish, and how Mikhail would arrange things with a meticulousness that made the world temporarily less dangerous. I thought of the music box and the idea of a man who could have anything in the world but chose to kneel and soothe his own child. When I went to the estate for the first time, the car that took me there smelled of leather and the faint, precise trace of someone else's cologne. The house sat quiet in a way that felt like a held breath. The walls were satin and the gardens were trimmed, as if the hedges were meant to be instruction manuals for order. Anton met me at the door with the recognition of someone who has been given permission to know the parts of a person that the rest of the world is not allowed to touch. He spoke to me about shoes and shoes-off places and where the light fell in the library.
Mikhail was in a blue room that had the same kind of severity as a museum. The toys were few and curated, the books lined up like an argument you could read through. He was arranging a set of spoons on the windowsill, counting them in a soft voice. When I sat down, he didn't look up immediately. He adjusted one spoon and then another until the row made sense to him. He touched the spoons as if they were notes. He looked at me finally and said, "You have small hands." "I do," I said, "for carrying small people." It sounded like a joke before I meant for it to be. Lily often rode on my hip like luggage you'd rather not lose. He turned the star stress ball over with his thumb. His face was brighter with the music box inside the house. He showed me how he lined silverware in ways that made the light hit them and make little rainbows. I told him about coffee spoons at the diner, about the way Carmen insists on a particular order. He listened like someone aiming to collect facts for a model he intended to rely on. Alexander watched us from the doorway of the library. He shut the door softly behind him and sat down a measured distance away, hands folded. The security stayed by the door, like good furniture. He talked rarely. When he did, he made sentences with the precision of someone who never wasted a word. "I can give you money," he said without preamble. "I can give you instructions. I can provide for Lily if you let me provide for Mikhail." He said it as if he were listing possibilities and not making an offer across a chasm. "You mean like charity?" I said, and it came out blunt because that's what it sounded like from the outside. "You mean as part of his life," he said, "not charity. He needs a presence that is consistent, that speaks in a way he recognizes. You have steadiness. You are not of this house. That may be useful." I thought of all the ways people sanitize power with phrases protection, security, provision. I thought of the men who worked the estate, the way Anton's jaw softened when Mikhail laughed. I thought about consent, about the necessity to name what we were discussing. What would it mean? I asked. I needed to hear the contours. It meant readings and routines, music and games with rules. It meant dinner at 4, stories at 6, a music box at 7. It meant the presence of men in the hallways who nodded when I passed, and the knowledge that when I left, the car would take me home. It meant a check that could hold back the landlord's knock for a long time. I asked about the nature of the house's other business. I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten like a spring. He answered with a wink of honesty and a refusal to romanticize what he did. "I have obligations," he said. "I do things that the world calls necessary. That does not pertain to what you will be doing." He did not apologize. He did not have to. I went home that night with the music box in my bag because Anton insisted I take it for Lily. He handed it to me like he was giving me a talisman that would remind him of our agreement, that I would not be able to stay an outsider forever. In the vestibule, where the light made everything look unforgiving, I sat on the stairs and counted the bills again, slower this time, to feel them real. The moral cost of a thing isn't always obvious at first. It can be a slow accrual, like the way salt eats at a wound. I found myself imagining Lily's future as a ledger with some brighter entries. I saw, in a ledger with Alexander Vulov's ink, a chance to clean the late notices off the table. I saw a night where I could breathe without thinking of the landlord's shoes outside my door. "Will you be lonely?" Lily asked the morning I signed the first paper. She wanted to know all the practical things. Would I be home for breakfast? Would she ride to school? Would she still have the purple hippo? She could distinguish between things that mattered and things adults pretended mattered. She sat at the kitchen table drawing a crown with crayons that had chewed tips. "No," I said, "I'll be with you every night." I believed it in the way you believe a map that's been redrawn with better lines. When I walked back into the estate the first night as a known quantity, the house seemed to test me, like an animal testing the return of a familiar hand. The garden smelled of wet earth and the hedge-cutting machines that had retired for the day. Anton's eyes assessed my shoes, as if trying to determine whether I belonged. Inside, the library smelled faintly of old paper and lemon oil. Mikhail handed me the star stress ball without waiting. He led me to the window and showed me how he arranged the silverware on a low table, making little paths the light could travel.
He took me by the hand and showed me a constellation he'd drawn in the margins of a book, strewn dots and lines that made a small map of his own. He read the names of the stars with a care that made them sound like promises. Lily, when she came once, fit between his knees like a wedge of the world that finally made sense. Volov watched from the doorway and sometimes from the couch, his presence a steady weight. Once, when Mikhail woke in the middle of a bad dream, it was Volov who uncapped the music box and let the thin song spill out into the room. The way he bent over his son and smoothed his hair was the same tenderness I had seen in the ballroom, but intensified by the privacy of a man allowed to be a father without the world lining his pockets with opinions. You could see grief in him as well, a kind of tidy sorrow he carried like a ledger he never balanced. He mentioned, once, in a sentence that slid past like a stone underwater, that Mikhail's mother had liked Swan Lake. The name of her wasn't spoken much. Grief in that house was like a careful shadow, acknowledged, functional, never overwhelming the floor plan. Time in that house was measured in small things: the click of a lock, the placement of a fork, the precise time when the security cameras dimmed. I kept a routine. I arrived at 4, sat with a child who saw the edges of the world in constellations and spoon arrangements, read to him until the pages were familiar as breath, and left at 8. The money came in thick envelopes on a Friday, crisp and decisive like a verdict. There were nights when I felt like a bridge that had been set to hold more weight than it was designed for. I noticed things. Anton meeting with men whose faces were like old debts. A car parked too long by the curb. A man watching the gate whose look said he was noting the faces of those who left the estate. Once, on the way out, someone I did not know stopped me in the parking lane and made a remark about who I was and what I had earned that day. The words were dull and meant to cut. I kept my face even and walked away. You learn quick to keep your feet moving and your hands off the pockets of strangers. At home, I lay awake after the shifts, counting and then uncounting the reasons I had said yes. There were small pleasures that came along with the fear: the security of a night with no landlord's voicemail, the clarity of a bank account that bore no visible scars. Lily's kindergarten paid for summer art class we couldn't have afforded. I watched her buy stickers in a store without me calculating how many meals we were trading for them. These were things that did not absolve me, they merely shifted the ledger. Mikhail began to trust me, not because of the money, but because of the fact that I kept returning. He taught me the satisfaction of a row of spoons that made the sun speckle like coins. He liked me to hum under my breath when I read, because it made the world less abstract for him. There were rituals: count to 8 before opening a door, line up cutlery from smallest to largest, place toys in a particular shelf, and I learned each of them with a care that surprised me. There were nights when he'd take the star stress ball out of his pocket and press it into my palm like a small stone of thank you. Volov was not affectionate, except when he allowed himself to be. He showed tenderness like someone who had been taught to be economical with feelings, careful, rationed, precious. But there were cracks. Once, when someone had said something about Mikhail's mother in a way that wanted the wound to sting more, Volov's hands tightened on the edge of the table, and Anton moved like a shadow. I saw the capacity in him to unmake things, the way storms undo houses. I also saw him spend an afternoon teaching Mikhail to pronounce constellation names, patient as a man who had chosen a different grammar for loving. I find that those who have power often measure it differently when a child is involved. The world becomes simpler, or at least it does, along the axis of what must remain intact. I watched Alexander invest everything he could spare into small rituals: the music box, a telescope pointed at the bay, a book with the edges gilded so they'd catch the light. He watched his son with a kind of awe that belonged to survivors who have learned to be grateful for the small mercies. I began to understand, in a slow and cautious way, that what I had accepted was not just money. It was a place inside a life that came wired with danger and with an honesty no one else offered. He did not pretend his hands were clean. He was a man who had lived in corridors where decisions had been made that left holes in other people's days. There was no apology for the architecture of his life. There was only a measured attempt at provision where he felt provision might matter. There were moments when I felt seen in ways that had nothing to do with money.
Alexander would glance at Lily and then at me and offer a look that recognized the daily bravery of being both breadwinner and bedtime holder. He began, slowly, to offer things that were not spoken in contracts: an extra check without announcement, an extra night when he saw the landlord's car outside my building and sent a message through Anton, "Go home, take tonight." Those messages came with the same controlled cadence as his speech: efficient, decisive, quietly expensive, like a kindness that also bought breathing space. Still, there were times when the scale would tip, and I would feel the old arithmetic bite: a delivery of men to some other place, a phone call I was told to ignore, a package that came to the house that smelled of solvents and other businesses. The moral friction was loud in the quiet hours. I told myself that I was keeping my daughter safe, that protection could be measured in numbers and stability. But there was always the cost you didn't account for when you first began to count bills: the subtle way your agency rearranges itself around someone else's textured authority. The dance at the gala had been small and without consequence, and yet it had been the hinge. 2 children moving together had made a man look at the ground he cared for and decide to seed it with more than money. In the weeks after, as Mikhail laughed and learned, and as I mopped and spooned and hummed, a tenderness grew that shaded the edges of what we had made. I began to know his jokes, the cadence of his counting, the little things that would rattle him if they were wrong. Lily and Mikhail discovered that together they could construct a small map of joy from cheap stickers and music boxes. But questions lingered at the edge of everything, like a sound from a room I wasn't allowed to enter. How much of my choice was choice when a father offered so much and the alternative was eviction notices and hungry nights? How much of Volov's tenderness was indebted to the power he wielded, and how much of it was real human warmth? The answers had no clean lines. One night, when the tide was low and the estate smelled of brine and cut grass, Anton closed the gates and then stood a little closer than he had before. "You understand," he said, and the sentence contained both warning and instruction. "I understand," I said. I understood the danger. I understood the help. I understood that in the ledger where I kept my daughter's future, I had rewritten a line and given it a capital letter. I also understood the small, strange comfort of being someone's chosen steady thing. Mikhail handed me the star stress ball that night and looked at me with the unadorned honesty of a child who had not yet learned to trade truth for fashion. "You are good," he said. He meant, I think, that I had kept coming. He meant that I had held the line of the small things steady. He meant that in a world measured by spoons and stars, my presence made sense. Outside, a car idled. Inside, a man folded his grief into careful gestures. Inside my pocket, the envelope with the crisp check sat like a small island of certainty. I felt, in my chest, something complicated that tasted like relief and fear and an ache of tenderness that surprised me because it had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with loyalty and survival. I didn't know then how long I could keep the balance. I didn't know how the ledger would tilt when someone asked for payment in ways that weren't financial. But I held Lily's purple hippo in my left hand and the star stress ball in my right, and let the two objects remind me of what I was walking toward: a life that offered safety and a life that carried the weight of other people's choices. It was impossible to know which would win out on the days when the world asked for too much. For now, the music box wound and unwound, and the children arranged their silverware like little architects of peace. Outside, lamps threw the glitter of the bay against the glass. Alexander watched his son sleep, and I watched him watch, and in that shared quiet we invented, for the first time, a small kind of trust. I closed my eyes and counted: 4 for the visits, 8 for the hours, a ledger that would, if I let it, keep back the landlord's foot for a while, a choice I had made with my hands steady and my heart careful. I had danced in a room full of strangers and found, oddly, the only place that felt safe enough to be honest. There were days ahead that would require other payments, of conscience, of courage, of bargaining with the small moral sums one keeps hidden in the corners of the mind. But the first check had been real. The first night had been honest. The children slept with music and stars, and the world, at least for a breath, made room for us. Outside the estate, the bay sighed like a thing unconcerned with human ledgers. Inside, I folded the music box into my bag and felt, for a moment, cherished in the way money and small mercies can make a person feel. I went home and tucked Lily under the blanket and kissed the curve of her head. The world was larger than our apartment and smaller than the ocean. I lay awake until my breath matched the tide, thinking of spoons and stars and the careful man who kept a music box polished for the sake of a child who loved the same song. Some choices are not clean. Some dances rearrange lives in ways you don't notice at first. The ledger would keep adding entries. The lines would blur. But on that night, with the star stress ball in my pocket and the purple hippo in my daughter's grip, I felt less invisible than I had in a long time. And that, I thought, is how visibility begins. Small, patient, and edged with the knowledge that we are never the only people balancing something we cannot afford to lose. When morning came, it smelled of coffee and the sea again, but the rhythm of it had a new weight. Lily turned in her sleep and thumbed the soft seam of the hippo. The music from the box quieted in my bag like something kept on low so it would not wake the rooms. I dressed in the gray that did not show spills and tied my hair up with the elastic that had lost its spring. Outside, the landlord's footsteps on the stairs were the same as ever, measured, impatient, but the shape of my days had shifted toward a man who kept a polished music box and a child with an honest face. There was a note folded under the door, the handwriting neat and decisive. "Come to the library at 9. Alexander." The library at Vulov's estate smelled of leather and salt and something older, wax maybe, or the hush of rooms that had been kept for people who could command the hour. Anton had been right to close the gates the night before. The estate kept itself like an animal with a readiness to snap. I walked up the gravel with my coat buttoned and my bag heavy with small things. The check lay folded deeper in the bag, an island I could not leave on the shore. Alexander met me by the tall window that looked over the bay. He had not changed from the man who watched his son sleep. He wore the same careful indifference that could be a kindness if you were very young and very much in need of shelter. He held 2 cups of coffee, as if deciding which one to drink. He handed me the warmer without asking, and stood with his back to the light, profile cut in quarry shadow. "Thank you," he said, and the sentence had no edge, only the economy of a man who had already calculated more than one outcome. "You wanted to see me?" My voice was steady because I had practiced steadiness in the last week, the way you practice not falling when the floor tilts. "I wanted to talk, yes, about the ledger you keep." He smiled the sort of small private smile that did not invite me in, but reminded me that he could. "About what you did last night. About what you might do if you could be useful." There it was, useful. The word was tidy and cold. I tasted it like metal. I sat because manners insisted, and because refusing to sit would have been another kind of refusal I could not afford. I started, then stopped. I came because the children were sleeping. And because the check arrived, Anton said from the doorway. He had been there without my noticing. He always seemed to move like someone who owned the shadows. And because you understand what it buys. Yes. The word was small, but true. Alexander's hands folded over the cup like a man folding in agreement. "I have ways of making life easier," he said. "Not many, but a few that are steady. I cannot change the landlord or the cost of bread, but I can make steps. I can keep small feet from hard streets for a while." "You can," I repeated. There was a pause heavy with the things people do not say in the presence of children. Mikhail's laugh echoed faintly from a distant room, bright as a bell. "And sometimes," he continued, "being useful requires things that are not ledger entries. It requires loyalty that is not written on paper. It requires discretion. That is all." He laid the last word on the table with gentle force, like a token he expected me to pocket. I understood what discretion looked like in practice. A smile at the right moment, silence when a rumor tried to be born, a presence in a room that would convince witness and eyewitness alike that nothing unsavory was happening.
I understood that it might be as small as sitting beside him at a charity dinner, keeping his coat neat, answering a question in the right tone so that others would think the night was ordinary. "It doesn't feel small," I said. My voice surprised me because it had anger threaded through it, the thin kind that comes from being cornered into choices. "It feels like an erasure." "For you," he said, and his eyes softened a degree that almost felt human. "It is protection. For me, it is company." He shrugged as if the word solved a problem. "I do not ask you to lie where it will hurt you. I ask you to be there when it matters. There are people who would take things from us if given the chance. You have a child. I have a son. I would like us both to sleep easier." He spoke of sleep in the kind of voice that knows the price of it. I remembered the long nights, counting hours, counting breaths, the ledger in my head where I had scribed the small mercies. I thought of Lily, of the purple hippo in her hand, of how much I would bear to keep that small creature safe. "And payment?" I asked, plain because I was plain. He named a figure less than luxury and more than a trifle. Enough to push the landlord back a month or two, to mend the dishwasher, to buy warm shoes for the winter. He did not fumble for anything grand. He spoke with the economy of a man who believed in efficient solutions. There was another part to his offer that he did not say in numbers. He wanted me to go to chosen rooms and sit like a receptacle for rumor. He wanted me to be visible and unimpeachable. He would dress his asking in gentleness and the music box's soft tune, and the ledger would accept it as a tidy transaction. I thought of Mikhail's hand, of the way he had looked at me with unadorned truth, and my chest ached with a multiplication of debts. Loyalty is not coin, it is weight. When I left the estate, I found Anton waiting at the gate. He offered no smile, but he inclined his head like a man acknowledging a bargain done. "We will have someone help you with the evenings," he said. "A car, nothing you cannot refuse." There was a softness in the promise that smelled faintly of threat. "Why me?" I asked when we were halfway down the lane. The bay stretched out like a sheet of old pewter at our side. "Because you are useful and quiet," he said, and his honesty was almost more unsettling than evasion. "Because you kept coming when others did not. Because you have a child, and that makes decisions for you easier to predict." His words landed with a thud. They were mercilessly true in the arithmetic of the world. A mother with a child is a neck easier to hold. Over the next week, my life became something clocked in small shifts. I went to the estate on pretense of teaching Mikhail to read the notes in the music box. I sat beside Alexander at a charity event where lanterns were strung like small gods, and people clinked glasses and spoke of markets and philanthropy as if the two did not conspire. I learned the exact cadence of nodding without eagerness. I learned how to keep my hands serene when questions aimed at someone else expected a deflection. Every time I returned home, the ledger in my head added figures. Rent paid, groceries bought, a little saved for Lily's blood sugar test, and the dentist who insisted on appointment cards. The money did what money always does. It smoothed immediate edges and made future edges sharper. It carved out a kind of breathing room that made my daughter's nights softer, and the cost of this breathing readier to be paid. But then, a thing that had not been written in any terms came due. It was on a Thursday. The air had gone sharp and the sky blunt and bright after rain. Lily at a fever that morning, small, climbing, soft and worrying, and the landlord's patience had thinned to the translucent paper of threats. I had paid with the first of Alexander's checks and thought it would be enough for another month, but then I learned that the landlord had accepted a new tenant for the apartment above us. A man with the kind of connections that makes even threats polite. There would be a notice in 2 weeks if the ledger did not stay balanced. I strapped Lily to my chest and walked to the clinic. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old magazines. While Lily slept against me, I found in the penciled notice on the desk a number that would be the cost of the test she needed. It was more than the check had covered. I sat with my back against uncomfortable plastic and watched mothers with neat purses and fathers with tidy patience shift in their chairs.
The world felt like a series of doors closing soft and fast. I called the number Alexander had given me when he said, in passing, that there were ways to arrange things privately. The woman who answered arranged for a different test, a discount, a favor owed. The ledger bent, someone on the other end had influence not yet counted in my rows and columns. The test came back certain enough for a plan. I breathed in a way I had not for days. That evening Anton came by the apartment with warm bread and a small jar of honey, the kind of items that read like care and like purchase both. He sat on the one chair and ate with measured enjoyment while Lily slept. He watched me as I washed a fork and set the table in the dim light. "She is brave," he said, not rhetorically, but as if to test my response. "She is stubborn," I corrected. I had never had the luxury of being brave. Stubbornness keeps you alive when care is scarce. Anton studied me. "You understand," he said. "I understand," I said back. But inside me, the ledger was not a thing one could fully understand with numbers. There were edges that bled. The look on Mikhail's face when he handed me the star. The way Alexander watched his son sleep as if that small piece were proof of his own goodness. There were also edges that cut, Anton's blunt observation about predictability among them. "You will be asked for more," Anton said finally, as if turning to the most painful page in a book. "It is better to know that now than later. You will be offered choices that are not gold or bread. You will be offered company, a silence, a story to tell people so they do not ask the dangerous questions. Say yes to what keeps the roof, and say no to what breaks your bones." "How do I know which is which?" I asked. The question trembled because I did not know whether conscience would hold or bend like wire. He looked at me with something like pity. "Some people know the line," he said. "Many do not. You have to trust that the part of you that kept Lily will keep you." He put the rest in another fold. "And if you ever need to leave, there are people who will help. But leaving costs." Leaving costs. The phrase lodged itself in the hollow of my throat. It was a ledger entry I could not yet balance. Days slid by with more appointments, small dinners where my presence was punctuation rather than content, nights where Mikhail hummed the music box's tune and thought of how easily children accept the world that adults designed for them. The estate loomed like a promise and a threat, depending on which hallway you stood in. My ledger swelled with good numbers and soft drownings. Then one night, Alexander called me to his study with an urgency that made the household staff move quiet and fast. Mikhail had fallen ill, nothing like Lily's fever, the doctor said, but something that required attention and a specialist at the city's central hospital. The kind of specialist that did not accept long waiting lists. I found myself driving past midnight, the city lights smeared like small apologies, Lily asleep in the car, and Anton beside me with his face a map of concentration. Alexander met us at the hospital entrance and did not speak much. He took our hands in a way that felt personal and careful and, cruelly, like a man asking you for the one thing you thought you had kept safe. "You can come," he said to me, "only for a little while, just to sit with Mikhail, to be there while the doctor explains things. Your staying will make him calmer." I thought of my own ledger, nights spent in chairs at clinics, the small sums that had kept our lights on. I thought of Lily in the car, of the way her breath spoke small patterns against the window. I thought of Mikhail and how his innocent judgments had already made me feel like someone who mattered. "You don't want me to lie," I said. "If there's anything that would harm—" "It will not harm," he interrupted. "It is a boy's cough, a thing that will be fixed. I only ask that you remain calm and patient." We sat in a room too small for the number of beeping machines and watched Alexander's hand loosen and close around his son's. There is a particular kind of observation in parenting that is equal parts fear and calculation. I had seen it in his face before. As the doctor moved in and out, as the machines sang small clinical hymns, Alexander turned to me and said, quietly, "Thank you." In the corridor afterward, as the night thinned into the pre-dawn, one of the hospital clerks mentioned a man from a foreign relief organization who was asking about a woman who had been at the estate. Rumors breed where power sits still. The clerk's tone was not cruel, only interested. When I stepped back into the cold, I understood how visible I was being made without my permission. On the way home, I kept thinking of ledger lines and how sometimes a single entry can change the margin of a life. The check had been real, the music box was real, the small kindnesses were real. But so were the expectations that came wrapped in gentleness, and the way a question left hanging can be a trap. That night, Lily
Slept fitfully, and I lay awake plotting small routes of escape I did not intend to take, just to know they existed. I thought of the time when I had been someone's chosen steady thing, and what that had cost. Evenings given, stories swallowed, an inner ledger where I balanced favors with shame. The balance keeps you alive, but there are days when the weight shifts. I did not know then what would finally require me to move, whether it would be the landlord's foot, a rumor that would find its way across a table, or the quiet asking for a thing I could not provide. I only knew that the ledger was writing itself, page by page, and that one day the handwriting might demand an explanation I could not give. For now, there were evenings to sit, plates to clear, children to soothe, and small mercies to accept. For now, the sea breathed at the edges of the city, and the music box wound and unwound like a patient heart. I added a note in the margin of my ledger: keep watch, keep small things steady, keep the line between what is demanded and what you can give. The next request, when it came, would not be in numbers. It would be in a shape that required me to be certain about who I was, and who I was willing to become in order to keep a roof over my daughter's head. I had kept the line so far. The night ahead would test whether I could keep it any longer.